The first session today will be chaired by Reinhard Volk from Johannes Kepler University in Linz and by Oksana Dobush from the Institute for Condensed Matter Physics. Reinhard Volk is a long-standing collaborator and good friend of many of us. His field of activity is condensed matter physics, statistical physics, history of physics, and in general history of science. He is Dr. Honoris Causa of our institute, and recently, just 2 months ago, he was conferred the Golden Doctorate from the University of Vienna. Oksana Dobush, her field of activity is also condensed matter, soft matter, phase transitions in soft matter, and she is co-heading the Council of Young Scientists in our institute and also the member of Young Minds of European Physical Society. So with all this said, I pass the stage to Reinhard and Oksana.
Okay, hello everybody. I don't need to introduce myself. This has been done by Yuri so kindly. I just want to say I'm in Austria. I'm sitting at my home. I'm retired. And it's a great pleasure for me to chair the first session of this year's Ising lectures. I followed these lectures over many years. And I'm impressed how the organizers manage these lectures under the present adverse conditions. We have this year an ambitious program and start today with 2 lectures. The first is given by Karoline Wiesner. I name her Karoline, but I change now to what is in the English countries. I think she is called Karoline. She is professor at the Department of Physics and Astronomy, University of Potsdam in Germany. Her academic life started in Heidelberg and took a global path through Sweden to the United States. I just named the sought-after Santa Fe Institute, and back to Great Britain, Sweden, Austria, now at Potsdam. Karoline Wiesner held visiting research professorships at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and at the Institute for Theoretical Physics at Lund University. She works in complex systems, where she is interested in the dynamics of such systems using information theory. Most recently, she has begun studying the stability of democracies. This and other projects are part of a long-term goal of building a quantitative framework for the dynamics of complex systems, firmly rooted in mathematics, physics, and philosophy of science. Karoline said that she was very much influenced by Mitchell Waldrop's book, Complexity, the Emerging Science at the Edge of Order and Chaos, in choosing her topics of research. I remember of this time, where the book was printed, the term self-organized criticality. Meanwhile, much progress has been made, and Karoline has written together with James Ladyman an own book with the title, What is a Complex System?, which was published in 2020. Her talk today considers a social topic and explains how a general, let's say mathematical, theoretical, physics concept translate from natural to social systems. And her talk is called Transition Between Political Regimes, Types in the 20th Century, Understanding Political Science Data with Complexity Science. Please, Karoline.
Thank you so much, Reinhard Volk and Oksana, also for chairing this session, for this very kind introduction. I appreciate it. I will soon share my slides and start the scientific part of this workshop. I have to say it's a very moving start of a workshop, certainly the most emotional I've ever participated in. And so I thank Taras Brick for his very personal and moving introduction and viewpoint from Lviv. There isn't much clever I can say about the situation apart that my thoughts are with you every day. So I will be sharing my presentation and start with the easier part of this workshop, which is the science. I believe you can see my screen now. I will go full screen with some slides that hopefully support what I'm going to say. So if you have any questions, if you'd like to make a comment, I'm certainly open for that. Just be aware you might end up on the recording. I don't know about that. Great. So as Anna Falk said in the beginning, I'm trying to bridge the gap between physics and political science. And this is really an ongoing research project where I'm only giving you the beginnings of it, but hopefully that will tell you that there's something here of interest even to physicists. So let me start with an opening teaser, which is the story, one of the many stories, about former East Germany when it still was its own nation, so DDR. And in 1979, there was just one of many comments by Axel Springer, who led the Europe's largest publishing company. This company refused to accept that East Germany was actually its own nation and that it wasn't just a temporary split of Germany into two, and that was really going to end any moment. And one way he put this was, as a German and as publisher of a liberal conservative German daily newspaper, whose long-term goals include the reunification of Germany, I see no reason to regard the quotes as obsolete, by which he means the quotes put around these letters DDR to say, well, this is only a quasi-country. So this was 1979. And then in August 1989, this is news by Los Angeles Times, says that the publisher has now decided to lift the quotes. This is in August 1989. So West Germany's largest publishing chain today ended a practice that has irked authorities in East Germany for 40 years, placing quotation marks around every reference to West Germany's socialist sibling state. Which means, it's one way to understand this, is that in August 1989, Axel Springer decided that, okay, I guess DDR is here to stay. Now, we all know what happened, just 2 months later. And that was the end of DDR and the actual reunification of the two parts of Germany. It's astounding that someone who is so well informed about politics did not see this coming. And it was a massive change in the state of a nation and the state of two nations because they were reunified. By this, I don't mean to say that Axel Springer, it was not as good as he thought he was. He certainly was amongst the most well-informed journalists Germany had. But this is just an instance of something that, here in the words of Jascha Munke, a political scientist, is evidence that even the best trained scholars of political science assume that extreme events are not going to happen. So now we're going from journalism to science, where this is actually something that political science has struggled with even considering, let alone modeling or understanding these sudden extreme transitions. So from a physics point of view, of course, we know something about extreme transitions, right? We know about phase transitions, and not least this audience I'm speaking to today knows everything there is to know about phase transitions. In order to understand extreme transitions in political science, the first step, in my view, is to clear up some of the terminology. So what do we mean by stability? And if an extreme transition happens to something else, that means that a point of instability is reached, of course, before this can happen. So what does stability mean? And when you go to different communities, you get different answers. So you ask a physicist, you ask a mathematician, you ask a computer scientist, you ask a political scientist, you get different answers. So I thought to just start with that. Think briefly about what these different answers are. And here are different notions or different terms that are being used. There is stability, there is robustness, there's resilience, and sometimes they're being used interchangeably, and sometimes they mean different things. Usually, we'd say resilience is more the ability to sort of come back to an equilibrium point after a perturbation to the system, whereas stability or robustness means just being completely insensitive to any perturbation from the outside. So there is one way of thinking about robustness which is more rooted in... There was a sound. Does that mean there's a question? Because I can't see any of that here.
Yes, apparently somebody wanted to ask a question. It's Mikhailo.
Yeah, I'm happy for that too.
Well, maybe that was a mistake.
Okay, all right. Well, please interrupt me if there is a question. So this, I call this modal robustness. That's maybe a somewhat philosophical term, but when I explain it to the physicists in the audience, it will be clear that this is really statistical mechanics. So the robustness in terms of modality means that a macroscopic state is insensitive to any changes on a microscopic level. So what this macroscopic state consists of can change in certain ways without changing anything on this macroscopic level. And of course, that's the whole idea behind statistical mechanics. You look at microstates that are equivalent and you count them up, and that means the number of ways in which a macrostate can be realized. And so you wouldn't notice the changes within these microstates from going from one to the other by just looking at the macrostate. That's modal robustness. Then there is, in machine learning, it's a similar idea, just put in very different terms, stability. So a computer program is set to learn from some experience E with respect to some task T and some performance measure P. Now, the performance on that particular task improves with experience E. And what you want that computer program to be stable with respect to is that when the experience slightly changes, you want the performance not to change dramatically. So slightly different input should still give you basically the same output. So that's also a form of stability, and it's related to the statistical mechanical idea of or form of robustness. Right, so this is what I just said. Now there are other ways of thinking about stability, of course, and they are probably more towards what we will need when we think about political systems. So here is the difference between static stability and dynamic stability. So static stability, you could think of that as being insensitive to perturbation, right? And what about dynamic stability? Well, there are two ways of thinking about this. One is really the system moves upon perturbation, but then it relaxes back to its equilibrium. And that's also in physics an often used sense of dynamic stability. But you can also think of dynamic stability, of course, as some system that is not fixed, it's not closed, and so it has, say, some influx of matter or energy, or both, and outflux of matter and energy. But the sort of the dynamic proportions stay constant within these dynamics. It's yet another way to think about this. So all of these are relevant in one way or another when we think about complex systems. And I am speaking to an audience that knows about complex systems, so I won't bore you with many of the details, but this book, which was mentioned kindly by Reinhard Volk, is the result of 10 years of discussion, really, with a philosopher of science, that's James Ladyman, who came into my office in 2007, I think, and asked me, so, Karoline, what is a complex system? And I didn't have, although I'd been working on complex systems for a few years by then, I didn't have a good answer. And that was the beginning of really a long collaboration, which finally resulted in this book. And so I'd like to spend just a few minutes on giving you some of the key points that we came up with, that we believe are, to some extent, stating the obvious, but that's good, because if we can agree on that, then we have a good starting point. And then just structuring a little bit the different views on what complexity is, what a complex system is, and making clear that, although they might sound different to begin with, they all boil down to some of the same key points. So one of the result that we came towards, if you like, is that there are aspects of complex systems that can be distinguished. So, and emergence, in fact, is not really one of these aspects. Emergence is a summary term for many of them. So we distinguish between, first of all, conditions for complexity. Those are features that sort of prepare the ground for something to be complex. Then we have the emergent features of complexity, and those are the things that make us interested in the system. And self-organized criticality was mentioned. That would be one of them. And then there is a distinction to be made between systems that are purely physical, chemical, and those that are functional or living. And for those, we get yet a new set of emergent features that make us interested in these systems. So let's begin with those that are the interesting features, if you like, the emergent features of complexity. And I invite you to pick a complex system of your choice. And, examples could be, of course, you could pick a magnet if you wanted to. You could also pick the brain, you could pick a swarm of animals, beehive, whatever might be your favorite system, and think of these aspects that I'm telling you about with respect to that system, and then hopefully they make more sense. So spontaneous order, self-organization is really the term that's being used, and it is, in our view, a very central term. So the system is able to organize itself into some form of structure that is not centrally controlled, but it is purely due to the many interactions that happen within the system. Order arises by itself, if you like, and hence the term self-organization. That's the most obvious one, and maybe the most important one. Nonlinearity is something that we observe very often. We use different terms for it. Power laws is one form of a nonlinearity that's arising due to interactions. Again, phase transitions, beautiful examples. Robustness as a general term, but it shows up over and over again. Of course, the structure that arises needs to have some form of robustness, otherwise we couldn't measure it. And then some systems have nested structure networks. Many people here work on networks, and they often exhibit this form of structure. So these are all emergent features that we'd like to understand and explain how they come about and predict, ideally. The question is, how do they come about? And before I get to that, the three features that we isolated, if you like, for functional systems, which include the living systems, are a modularity, which means that functions are sort of separated onto different parts of the system. One example to think of here would be an ant colony, where you have, it's a social organism, and you have different groups of animals are responsible for different parts of that social organism to function. So that would be, foraging for food, tending to the nest, feeding the new breed, and so on and so forth. Of course, history and memory are also, memory is a property of a functional system. And adaptive behavior, it's already in the name. It needs to be a living or a functional system to have any behavior in the first place. And then if it adapts that behavior to outer circumstances, then we call that adaptive behavior. And complex systems, functional and living, have that ability. Okay. So how do these things come about? And this gets us back closer to the physics again. Certainly what all of these systems have in common is that they are consisting of many elements, and there are many interactions between these elements. And that's absolutely central. So this whole self-organization concept can only come about if we have many things that interact in many times. In addition to that, the second term, this what I call disorder and diversity, is super central for the formation, the spontaneous formation of order. So we can think of disorder as a necessary ingredient for order to form. And that might sound a bit contradictory, but it is the disorder, which means that the interactions that happen on this microscopic level happen sort of probabilistically, stochastically, if you like. And through these probabilistic interactions, we get an emergent feature of order. And how is that possible? It's only possible because of feedback. And the last concept here is a non-equilibrium. Has different forms in different contexts. So in physics, we have a very clear view of what non-equilibrium means. But even in social systems, there is a notion of non-equilibrium. And if you just think as the opposite of static, then that certainly applies to all complex systems. Now, I hear some noises. Is there a question or a comment?
So yes, there is a question, Reinhard.
Yeah,
Do you
may
have
I
a
ask
question?
You speak about emergence, and
Yeah.
what I know from the literature that there are two types of emergence. One, as usual in physical systems, like a magnetic system, magnetization, I think, emerges. It's from the interaction. But there is another thing that is this emergent of the other type, which is not in, so to say, reducible to different levels and microscopic behavior. Do you think when you speak about the disorder which should be in the system, that you think of emergence of this more deeper type?
Now, yes, thank you for the question. There is a lot of different notions around in terms of emergence in the literature. What we're trying to do is to keep it as general as possible. So certainly the first type of emergence that you mentioned is covered here. The second type of emergence, if I'm thinking of the same thing, is something that cannot be, I think you used the word reduced even, reduced to the microscopic level and sort of explained in terms of microscopic level constituents plus interactions. And that type of emergence I do not consider, because from the definition, it is not what we can study with a scientific method. Am I answering your question to some extent?
Yes, I see that you discriminate between the two emergence, but I see a difficulty to do this. I'm not sure if I understand emergence in any case you mentioned, at least at living systems or something like that, if there is not a difference to just a physical system. This is my problem, so to say. But do you...
Okay, well, yeah, sorry.
This is... I can understand emergence just in a physical sense. But
Yeah.
in the other words, something additional is included, which is not, say, you said it, I think, it's not included in science. Is this correct?
It sounds like we agree, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's something I don't think I have any slide on this, but there is this, it's actually stated quite often, even by physicists, which is that a complex system defies the reductionist methods. So claiming that you cannot study complex systems with the reductionist, the usual scientific method of reductionism, and that is plain wrong. And I believe what you call type 2 would fall into that. You cannot study it with a reductionist method because you cannot reduce it to anything.
Yeah.
And in that sense, I am excluding it. Yes. And
yes,
I do agree with you. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Caroline, we have also
Yes.
a question in chat. So
Yes.
Tim Booker asks you, this is strong versus weak emergence.
I have to say that I will have to defer that question. I'm happy to think about it because I do not recall the exact difference between strong and weak. I know there is that distinction. So in order to answer that question, I have to go back and refresh my memory on what the distinction is between strong and weak emergence. So I apologize, I cannot really answer that question.
Yes, my questions went in the same direction. And as
Right.
I know no example of strong emergence. That's the problem. I do not know one example which I could analyze with scientific ideas, you see. So I think that goes in the same direction. Okay.
Okay. In that sense, then, if given what you've just said, we are talking about weak emergence. But there's lots of confusion in that emergence literature, and we consciously made a decision of staying out of it and really sticking to what Philip Anderson has said, which is that emergence is a property of a collection of systems that or a collection of elements that the individual parts do not have. And so in that sense, an individual ant does not have the property of social organization, whereas 10,000 ants put together have it. But we can always reduce it to what the individual ants are doing and how they're interacting. Yeah, this is interesting, and I suppose we could spend a long time on this. So I suggest I move on, but do stop me anytime. Thank you for the questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Particularly, I can't see any faces, so it's nice to hear some voices. Good. So these two properties here, disorder and feedback, are the ones that will reoccur throughout the rest of the talk because they're so central in leading to self-organization and leading to structure, and also in leading to stability. Okay. Good. Now, I call this the power of randomness. We all know about the power of randomness. We have here in the Ising lectures, so I don't have to explain this picture to you. But temperature here plays the role of randomness, and it plays the role of facilitating structure formation. Of course, only in a certain regime, but that's one way to think about the role of temperature in the Ising model, is when you're just in the right regime, then you see interesting stuff, which you can think of the middle image here as interesting stuff because there is non-trivial structure emerging, if you like. And it's emerging out of the many interactions between the spins. Now, going to stability again, here is a more mathematics view of stability, which is, you have different potentials, or you have one potential which changes over time. And depending on how this potential looks, the system might be very stable in its minimum here, but then when this energy minimum starts to disappear, well then here the system is very unstable, so just a slight perturbation will move it over to a different equilibrium state. The underlying mathematics turns out to be exactly the same as the kinds of calculations we do for a simple Ising model. So this is the mathematics of tipping points. It's related to stability, it's related to fluctuations. And all I want to say here is that this framework allows us to think of stability also for non-physical systems, because fluctuations is something that we can measure in all sorts of systems, really. And so there's lots of work going on here in terms of complex systems and their stability and just measuring fluctuations. Now, what would be nice, of course, is if we had a quantitative way of studying stability of countries. And it doesn't have to be democracies, but let's just say stabilities of nation states. And even nicer if the data were such that we could, for example, measure fluctuations and foresee tipping points. So we're not there yet, but what I'm going to show you in the rest of this talk is a data set where at least we can start to think along these lines and think along the lines of what is the notion or what is the role of disorder and feedback to lead to stability in political systems. Okay. Now, I'll give you one more example before I get onto that. I'll try to keep it brief, which is from biology, where again, the disorder actually plays a huge role in facilitating the transition from one state to another. And this is stem cell differentiation, where stem cells are in some form of energy minimum, if you like, and they stay there quite stably until signals do come from the outside to trigger a transition to a somatic cell of whatever type it's going to be. And what biologists or biochemists would like to know is, where is this point of no return? So when is the system shaken so much that it can actually not return back to its stem cell state? And we asked for a very simple, we used a very simple technique, which is the Shannon entropy, which if you're not familiar with it, it's a function of a probability distribution. This is what it looks like. And it really, the more uniform that probability distribution is, the larger this function is. And on the opposite end, it's the minimum value it can take is 0. So it measures uniformity of a probability distribution. And then what we did is we took a stem cell system, which is blood cells that are in some form of stem cell state. And once they get kicked out of it, the process is started in which they differentiate into different types of blood cells. So we wanted to measure the entropy of the system over time. And why did we want to do that? Because there was this analogy to statistical mechanics, which was done by MacArthur and others, who said, well, clearly the entropy must be maximal in this initial state, stem cell state, because the cell has all the possibilities still. It could become anything it wants to. Whereas in the end, when it's decided to be a particular somatic cell type, there is no choice left, so the entropy should be 0. So this was the hypothesis being put forward by this group. So we took stem cell data that were taken by a different group, were publicly available, and we measured over this pseudo time, if you like, lineage time, we measured the Shannon entropy in the gene expression. So that means how many different gene expression configurations, if you like, are being actually realized by these cells, because each cell can be measured individually today. It's amazing technology. So that's what they did. We measured the entropy, and if the hypothesis had been right, then the entropy should have gone down as lineage time goes up. So we should have seen this sort of diagonal line, which we didn't. We saw the entropy at a certain value, but in between states, it goes up and then it goes down, and presumably further down than initially. So instead, what we saw in the data was more this. So it is as if the system increases its randomness on its way towards this point of no return, then makes a decision, and then it goes down to a lineage. That's our interpretation, and what I like about it is, well, A, it's a simple technique based on complicated experimental data, but they were available, and it allows us to think of disorder or randomness as opening up opportunities for new solutions, if you like, for new for new cell types. It's one way to think about it, and it's a way to think about it which I want to keep and move, translate to political science in some sense. Here's another example where randomness actually plays a beneficial role. And that is a study which was done by the group by Christakis, where they took, a group of people, if you like, and these people had the task of, so each person is sort of a node, and it is connected to other nodes, and the task is to satisfy a certain rule of colors here, which they can only see locally what the other nodes, which color the other nodes have. But the goal was to choose a different color than its neighbors. So this node up here already has a problem because the neighboring node is also orange. So, this node should probably switch to something else, but then this node might also switch to something else. So you see, it's an optimization problem which is only being looked at locally. The question is, how do these people perform? How long time does it take them to resolve all the conflicts? Can they even do it? And they measure this. This is an online game they actually had people play. And it takes a while, and in some cases they can actually solve it. In other cases they cannot, but the number of color conflicts goes down over time. Now what they did is they put in bots that play random. So they are nodes in there that just change color randomly. And it turns out for a certain level of so-called bot noise, actually the performance of the system as a whole improves. So the bot noise can't be too much, but if it is 10%, then actually it helps. And why does it help? Again, for a physicist, this is almost obvious. It's like the simulated annealing algorithm. You want to find an optimal solution by just sampling the system locally. Well, noise helps you to get out of suboptimal solutions. Right? It's a very, very nice way of showing that works actually translated to a very different system, which is coordination game between human people. Now let's take these results and ideas and concepts and think about democracies. So this is work I've done in collaboration with political scientist Matthew Wilson from the University of South Carolina. And there's a preprint available on my website, and Samuel Bean is a young scientist working with me. So the situation is, I'm just putting this up here as a sort of a starting teaser. As a recent study by The Economist, where they have some way of classifying regimes, and they put here, just discrete categories, if you like. Authoritarian regimes are red, and then light blue is flawed democracies but reasonable, and dark blue is full democracies. And you can see that basically only Scandinavian countries really hit that mark. This is 2022, and this alone is hard to interpret, but what's more interesting is to look at how this has developed in the recent years. So these are data I extracted from the various reports by the Economist Intelligence Unit, where they have their own method of quantifying democracy. And it's a one-dimensional index that goes from 0 to 10, and it's some aggregate of different properties, media, press freedom, competition in elections, and so on and so forth. But it illustrates quite well that, so I put North Korea in here as a sort of the bottom line. It's the country that scores worst, and pretty constantly so. Norway is class champion, has been for a long time. But then there are these in-between countries that they're doing not too badly, but it looks like they have decreased over time. And this is something which is very much hotly debated in political science at the moment. What is that? Is that really a form of instability? And does it mean that these countries become less and less stable and might topple at some point into some form of autocracy? Or are these just fluctuations? And the answer is totally open as far as I'm aware. Now, what would be nice is to have data that we can, actually proper high-dimensional, dense data that we can, as physicists and mathematicians, work with. And this is where the VDAN project comes in. So the VDAN project is something which is initiated by Stefan Lindberg at Gothenburg University. And they have, over the years, put together a huge data set on, well, all countries of the world, or there might be a few missing, but about 190 countries are in that data set. And they're asking country experts for every year and every country about 24 questions. I'll show you a list of the questions in just a moment. What that means is that we have, for every country and every year, and this is dating back to 1900 and sometimes even further back, we have an assessment in terms of a range of variables that can be between 0 and 5. And there are generally, about 100 experts or so per country that are answering these questions. So then some statistical analysis is put on top to make sure, as much as you can, to extract the bias that these experts might have, and to get an average quantity on the press freedom in their country, on the possibility or the opportunities for citizens to contribute to politics, all sorts of questions. And that is still not a physical measurement instrument the way we're used to. But it is a measurement instrument, and it is certainly something where we can start doing analysis on the uncertainty of the measurement instrument and also on the data. So those are the data that we started working with. Now here are just a few, I'll just show you a few questions that are being asked about each country. So for example here, these terms V2, L and TIM are unintelligible, but in this national election, were opposition candidates subjected to repression, intimidation, violence, harassment by the government, ruling party, or their agents? It's one question that is being answered. In this election, was there evidence of vote buying? In this election, was there reasonably accurate voter registry? So you see there are questions on how the election is run. There are questions on, actually these are all about the elections, but other questions are about the media. Is there media bias against opposition parties, for example? Do major print media represent a wide range of political perspectives, and so on and so forth? So these are media questions. And then there are some civil society questions, like the last one. To what extent does the government achieve control over entry and exit by civil society organizations into public life? And on the whole, there are 24 questions, and they're all asked only for those countries that run elections. Now, it turns out that today, almost every country in the world is running an election. And we know that not almost every country in the world is a good performing democracy. So clearly, just because a country is running an election doesn't mean it is a democracy, which means that this data set gives us access to a whole range of state forms. They all run some form of election. And in some cases, these elections are just facade. In other cases, they are actually probing the opinions of the citizens. Now, this VDAN project does come with a democracy index. It does come with several, actually, and one of them is the Electoral Democracy Index, which is the one I'm focusing on. And it's an aggregate index, which takes all these 25 questions and does actually some quite sophisticated Bayesian model on them. And then outcome is an index on how good is that democracy. Okay. Now, if we just take that index and we look at have democracies declined, here I've just put together data from, or differences between 2011 and 2021. Now, I'm not asking you to read all these country names here, just to notice that there are a lot of them that have declined. So this index goes between 0 and 1. So some of them have declined more than 0.3, so more than 30%. And others have declined just a little. Of course, for North Korea, declining a little doesn't mean very much because it's, it doesn't have much to begin with, whereas Norway has declined just as much, and of course from a very different level. So these are only relative declines. Are there any positive news? Well, here's some positive news. There are countries that have increased in democracy. So what we're asking now is, we want to zoom in and understand some of that a little better. Okay. So what we did was we took these 24 questions, and rather than taking this aggregate index of democracy, we want to find, is there any structure in this 24, this is a 24-dimensional data space, right? So you can think of every country is moving in these 24 dimensions over time. And we want to know, is there any structure in that distribution of countries in this high-dimensional space? And one of the standard techniques to find out is so-called principal component analysis, which is the term used in statistics. In physics, it's singular value decomposition. So it finds the direction within this high-dimensional space that has the largest variance. So here's an example in just 2 dimensions. So these light open circles are the data. And then the direction is this blue one, which is, the one that would be identified by this algorithm or this mathematical technique. And it projected onto this axis, the variance of these blue points is the largest one for any possible direction of this vector. Which means that we can reduce, in this example, we can reduce this data set, which is 2-dimensional, onto 1 dimension, without losing much information. That's the whole idea. So you scale this up to 24 dimensions and you ask, can I reduce this down to a smaller number of dimensions that I can actually think about without losing much information? And it turns out that that is possible. And when you do that, let me get this all up on the screen here, then if you just use the first main direction, so you just use the first so-called principal component, you keep almost 70% of the information quantified in that way. So almost 70% of the variance of your data. If you include the second one, then you get almost 80% of the variance. So we did exactly that. We kept the first 2 components, and it turns out the third one is really just suffrage, which means who is allowed to vote. And today suffrage is almost universal. There's hardly any country that restricts the voting right to a subset of the grown-up population. So if you just pick these 2 first components and you look at which questions are most relevant for it, then you see that the first component, all these purple and red ones are very relevant. Whereas for the second one, it's mostly the green, what is this, turquoise maybe. So these are the election questions. So a country that scores high on the second component is sort of doing very well in the election questions. So there are no irregularities, there's no vote buying, it's very peaceful, it's very well organized elections. A country that scores high on component 1, well, it's basically scoring high on everything. So you can see this here in the list. Right, so principal component 1, if you score well on any of these questions, you're a good democracy. So in principal component 1, positive scoring means they're all relevant. Whereas for principal component 2, positive scoring, if you score positively on these election variables, then you get a high value in PC2. Whereas if you score low on the others, and the others are media freedom, citizen participation, then you also get a high score on component 2. So component 2 sort of pulls apart citizen freedom and election quality, whereas component 1 puts it all together on the same side of the scale. I'll explain this one more time, because it's really the essence of what we found here. Let me see, maybe I skip this one because it's not so important. But here we put all the data that we have into one graph. What is this graph? It's component 1 on the x-axis, which is really a measure of democracy, if you like, as a whole. Component 2, which for positive values says election is very well organized, whereas citizen freedoms are not that much respected. And scoring negatively means election is probably quite chaotic, maybe corrupted, but citizen freedoms are stronger. Okay, so it's a very, yeah, it's a dichotomy on component 2, if you like. And then every point here in this graph is one country at 1 year. So we have roughly, 200 times 120 data points here, roughly. Okay. And what we can say when we look at what these individual countries are is that all the Western democracies are located in this very dense region up here. And all the autocracies are located in the region up there, and then in between, lots of other countries. And I'll show you some of the specific countries in just a moment. And what we have here is actually, this is important to check against the political science literature, it is what people have done by hand when they categorized a particular country. So when they categorized, say, Cuba is somewhere up here, and they say, yes, Cuba is an autocracy, because somebody thinks so, right? And our data give you that almost objectively, back what political science thinks to begin with. So that's good. Right, so I'd like to show you that over time, just because it's fun. And I'm also aware that I think I have another 10 minutes. Is that correct, or am I going over time? Oksana, what's my time left?
Yes, you have 10 minutes more.
10 minutes, okay, I'm almost done. So you should be seeing now 1900 on the screen, a graph which moves. So here I'm showing you this as a simulation, if you like. A visualization is the right term. So here we have countries. So here we have the United States, for example. We have Finland, Italy, Chile. So these are the countries that are in the data set where we have data for 1900. It's not many, right? But when we let time run forward, more countries will emerge, well, because they start to exist. And you see countries moving, and the size of the blobs is the population size. So we see India here, China just made a move in the Cultural Revolution. 60s, a lot of decolonization events. Let me just stop here briefly and make this a little bit slower. Go back to 1985. You will see 1989 is coming up, and you see a huge shift from up here to down here. I don't know why it's not showing properly. So we see that countries are moving in this space over time. And now we are in 2021, and the distribution is roughly like that. So what do we have here? It's not showing me the countries. Australia is there. All sorts of countries are in this data set. So this is basically a dynamical system, right? And we can think about it and analyze it in such a way. So this is now really the ongoing work, which is looking at, well, up here is the autocratic corner. That was basically empty in 1900. And then it started to be populated in the 1940s, of course. But it's persisted ever since. There's this sort of autocratic cluster up here. It's thinned out a little bit. The good news is the density is really moving towards this more democratic state. But interestingly, we see this, let me see, we're going back to this one here. We see a kind of a V shape. That's one interesting thing which we're trying to understand at the moment. The other thing is that when it comes to the democratic cluster up here, it is really quite, in terms of the second component, it's quite narrow. So there is no variation, if you like, in where democracies are, whereas autocracies, well, they span, this entire space in terms of component two. So this is where, my, if you like, my association part of the talk begins. So I want to end on that. First, I want to revisit the concept of randomness. And here I want to quote David Runciman, who is a political scientist, who says, "The randomness of democracy, which remains its essential quality, protects us against getting stuck with truly bad ideas." And one way to think about this position of democratic clusters in this space, two-dimensional space, is it is not in the most organized corner of elections. It is as if there was a certain amount of randomness that keeps democracies where they are. And other people have said this before us, some degree of diversity and partisan disagreement in a democracy is healthy and even necessary. And in fact, randomness was already part of the Athenian democracy, where people were, to some extent, selected by lot. And so that's, a starting point for future work, which is to understand the position of democracies in this part of the two-dimensional space. So here are some references, apart from the working paper, which is online, some other papers I did earlier on, and here is everything that I've used in this talk. And with that, I very much thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for the interesting talk. There was also one comment. Patsana wants then to make a comment. Patsana wanted to make a comment, I have seen.
So there was a question here in the chat is, do you have interpretations for the principal components? So this is something I was trying to convey. That is the first principal component, because it also correlates very highly with this electoral democracy index of the VDEM project. We interpret this as the overall electoral democracy of that state. The second component, which is per definition mathematically orthogonal, so it has zero correlation with the first component, and we interpret that as the trade-off between, on one end, well-run, tightly run elections, and on the other hand, maximal citizen freedom. So if you are in a positive part of that principal component 2, you have maximally well-run elections, controlled elections, I call them better, and minimal citizen freedom. And on the other end, you have maximal citizen freedom versus uncontrolled elections, which can be corrupted or simply badly organized and intransparent. Of course, a democracy, you want both to be there, right? Which is why these two components really say very different things. I hope that is helpful.
Is there another question, please? Jin Wang wants to say something. Please.
Can people unmute themselves, or maybe they cannot? Is that a problem?
They can.
Oh, they can. Okay, good.
Yes.
So, Jin Wang, you wanted to say something? Please open your microphone.
Well, while we wait for Jin Wang, there's a question in the chat. How many bees does it take to develop a social behavior? That's a nice one. I cannot answer this for bees. I know for ants, again, depending on the colony type or the ant type, but you have, when you put, I think this was army ants, you put 100 of them on a surface, they will just run around in circles until they die of exhaustion. Whereas you put 10,000 of them together, they will develop social behavior. So there is a threshold somewhere, and it's very different for different animal types and species.
There's another hand, Yuri Suchowski. Please.
Ja, erstmal schönen guten Tag aus Wien und danke schön für einen schönen Vortrag.
Gerne, hallo.
Interessant. Do you hear me?
I can hear you well, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Nochmal danke für den schönen Vortrag. I have a question concerning not the application of proper orthogonal decomposition. It was perfect, and of course this method does not lie. What you put inside, you get outside. It is just mathematics. The point is, I have some doubts what concerns the collection of parameters. It is similar if you make a calculation for magnetic transition. If you put the wrong energy from spin-spin interaction of electrons, then independent of the correctness of your method, which must be perfect, you will get not a proper result. And my question is, don't you see some problems with the introducing parameters? As example, I just remember the map you have shown about the democracy in Europe, and the France and the Germany was much more blue than Spain or France. And I don't think the people in Spain share this opinion. So the point is, how objective are the parameters which you introduce? It was one point of my comment, and another one is, if you calculate the interaction of electrons, the electrons don't have emotions. And they have just the Coulomb interaction, and it is. And in social and political events, there are the emotion of leading people play an important role. You remember the reunification of Germany, and then I would say, imagine Günther Schabowski would have different emotion on this press conference and would not say, das gilt unverzüglich jetzt. So this point, or let us say, Mikhail Gorbachev would not stop the possible military intervention. So these points which are important in such social and political transitions, I don't think they are introduced in your model.
Oh, now I've lost your. I think I heard all the question. Both great questions. So the first one on the bias, this is something that I still have to learn much more about, but they do have, so statistics provides tools for extracting a bias from expert elicitation data. And of course that's not perfect. And that's, so I cannot say for sure how it's done. I know it is done to avoid exactly that. So the graph I showed you was actually done by one group, this economist intelligence unit, which is probably much more biased than the VDEM data I showed you, which are really where they do their best to take care of the bias. So that's as much as I can say about this, but the question is absolutely justified. And then the other question you had about emotions and individual behavior. So here I see an opportunity, well, it's a challenge and also an opportunity for complexity science. So certainly we cannot model individual people's behavior. That's the realm of psychology. But we can model potentially the behavior of a collection of people. And of course, we can either stay away from these individual actions, but then, as you say, some of them might be super relevant for the future of, say, does the reunification really happen or not? And here, again, I see an opportunity which is related to the stability. So does an individual's action have the potential of changing the dynamics of the entire system? I'm really just thinking out loud and wishful thinking maybe, but to quantify the stability would also have to relate to the influence of individual actions. I'd say that's a goal of this as well. So I can't, yeah, this is, I fully agree with your concerns and even potential criticism that needs to be made clear, and it's an opportunity for complexity science to do something.
Maybe I have some proposal, and namely, if you have phase transition from water to gas, and you have 100 degrees centigrade, when you don't have nucleation centers, water will not have this phase transition. So maybe you have to introduce some nucleation center in a critical system, like Günter Schabowski, which introduced the phase transition.
So that would be, if we could take this analogy and make it somehow quantitative, that would be absolutely thrilling. Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Okay, there are two other questions. Yuri, please.
I have other my questions.
Yuri has a question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think Jing Wang was before me. Maybe he first.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we hear you.
Oh, okay. Yes. Sorry. Last time I screwed up.
No problem.
Karoline, that was a great talk and I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
I have a specific question about your histogram with the principal component 1 and 2. It looks like at the end of the day, you have like sort of one basin of traction concentrated on the democracy. On the other hand, when you show the history of these contour plots, it looks like there are like bistability, or at least like two blobs or two basins of traction gradually shifted towards the end. But towards the end, it looks like you have two basins of traction. So I'm confused. At the end of the day, do you have one basin or two basins of traction? Because in the history contour plot, it looks like two basins of traction all the way till the end. So can you explain a little bit more details?
Well, in a way, I think I don't have the answer to your question, rather than I have the same question. I mean, can we even quantify a basin of attraction? That's something we're working on at the moment. And it certainly looks like this cluster of democracies is a basin of attraction, because we do see this mass migrating towards it. But then not all the mass in that diagram is moving towards it. So is there another basin of attraction which is maybe at this autocratic level? I mean, the first step is, and again, this is all work in progress, the first step is to quantify, can we even specify, yes, here are two basin of attractions, just in some potential picture. And if that is so, then the question would be why, of course, and what facilitates transitions between the two, either way. So I love your question. and I can only join you in that question. Do I understand you correctly? You see the center in the upper left corner or in the lower middle? Where did you see the second?
When you show the
basin?
history counterplots, looks like on the upper right and on the upper left there were like two basins, and it gradually shifted towards the center. There is a basin, and the upper right there is a basin. Looks like.
Right. Yeah. But, that's something we want to confirm quantitatively to see if that's actually the case. Yes, thank you for that question.
And one more question related to this is, since most of the variables looks like a single variables, so is there anything like variables and interactions among variables, like a network that is underneath this democracy behavior?
Are you referring to interactions between the variables or between the countries? Between the variables?
It could be between the countries, yes. I mean, but of course you have many variables that accordingly. So I'm not sure which one is interacting with which one. So, my question is: there a network behind this emergent behavior of like concentrated democracy, concentrated autocracy?
Nice, really nice question. I'm just writing it down. I don't know the answer, but certainly, I mean, of course, there are correlations between these variables, and some are more strongly correlated than others. We have looked at that, but we haven't actually gone to do some, say, clustering analysis of that network, correlation network. But that sounds like a great idea to do. Thank you.
So, okay, I think now Yuri.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Karolina, for this very, very nice talk. I like it very much, as all your talks. My question is, however, not about the final part of your talk, but at the beginning or in the middle, when you were convincing us that the randomness plays a beneficial role. You mentioned your study of this biological system when you have transition from stem cell to somatic cell. Yeah. And, at some point, I expected that you will rely not on channel entropy, but on complexity to judge. Did you try also kind of Kolmogorov complexity or some feature to?
Okay, great. The short answer is no. So, I mean, complexity there are measures of complexity out there. But most of them do measure some form of order. So we could just as well have taken one of those, and then presumably we would have seen a drop in them. So the complexity, because they mostly measure order, drops at this transition point. We haven't tried that. We also haven't tried Kolmogorov complexity. That could be fun. Yeah, no, we haven't tried that.
Okay, thank you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I have again a question. I mean, you looked at the time dependence also of this development. Do you have any idea about the scale of time? What do you think? Could you see something in small countries? Oh, there is a characteristic time scale for change.
Yeah, great question. We have some preliminary results. So I didn't show you any analysis of the dynamics. I just showed you the overall distribution. But it looks like there is actually no time scale in the sense of there are all sorts of time scales. So there's no characteristic time scale.
Yeah.
You see movements on very slow and very large and everything in between scales, and it looks like there is some form of, it's not a proper power law, but it is that form of extreme values distribution movements. So that's something we're working on at the moment. And the way you put it is a great way of putting it. Is there a characteristic timescale? It looks like there is not, actually.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Are there other questions? Please raise your hand. So there is a new message from Andre.
Yes.
Where
so,
the main...
yeah, I'm just reading it out. Were the main principal components recalculated for each time point, or were the historical data just projected? So the principal components were calculated for all the data in one go, meaning across all years and countries. So that means the center, so the mean of 0, is across all years and all countries. Which means if we took another 10 years, the coming 10 years, then that would slightly shift the analysis. But this analysis is taking everything from 1900 to 2021 in one go.
Okay. Any other question?
Yes, there's a question in chat from Uwe Tauber.
Yes, so for a given country, no characters timescale, any evidence for critical slowing down? Well, that one I cannot answer. That's a great question. Is there critical slowing down? I'm not sure we can say. Well, I don't know yet. It's something, ask me again in 3-4 months' time. And the second question, any systematic currents in the parameter flow? Interesting. So trying to understand this question. Systematic currents in the sense of... No, I'm not sure I understand that question. Can you rephrase, maybe?
Could you?
Yeah, I'm unmuted. I hope you can hear me and maybe even see me.
Yes.
Very
I
good.
can hear you perfectly.
Excellent. Very good, Karoline. Very nice talk. So
Thank you.
I was actually thinking that Jin might ask that question, since he likes this kind of stuff. If you characterize these non-equilibrium steady states, which maybe this is, maybe it is not, it's not clear if it's stationary, you'd like to characterize the distributions of where you are, but also the probability currents. And you have time-dependent data, so you have these really nice flows, of certain countries, some of which systematic, like in 1989, in this principal component decomposition. And I was wondering if you can quantify that and find some interesting patterns or even systematic currents in this parameter flow. And maybe you need more than these two variables, but it would be very interesting, I think.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for clarifying. Again, I don't know yet. We've done some initial, simple tests in sort of tiling this space to identify some structure of, as you call it, parameter flow or probability flow from one to the other. There was no obvious structure, and I now suspect the reason is that we have this lack of characteristic timescale that makes this approach not the best approach. But maybe if one rescales something, I don't know, then one can seize that structure. We're still looking for that structure.
Okay. Are there other questions? If it's not the case, I think I would like to thank again for this very interesting talk. And I think according to the time schedule, we would then proceed in just 15 minutes. Is this okay?
Right, very good.
Yes, correct.
Yeah, okay. So then we see again in 15 minutes.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Pleasure. Oh, there's someone who wants to say something, please.
I think it was about
Europe.
I think it was about applause.
No, thank you. I would like just to thank for nice talk. I'm sorry. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.